Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm your host, Alex Netty, and today we have an incredible discussion for you. We're going to be talking about a perennially pesky topic. It's technical debt. Before we get started, though, if you've been following all of our great approachable cybersecurity content on social media, make sure you find us on all the networks with our handle @Hive Systems. So make sure to give us a follow or subscribe today so you don't miss the latest and greatest cybersecurity news. Talking about technical debt, it is the result of taking shortcuts to meet short-term objectives at the expense of long-term flexibility and security. That term technical debt has come to encompass a number of issues in the industry, things from bugs to legacy code, to missing documentation, to silver bullet tooling, and everything all the way down through poor system visibility, old hardware assets, weak governance, and everything in between. So with such a wide net, understanding how technical debt impacts you and your company can be a challenge. How that intersects with cybersecurity is an extra layer of complication, and that is what we're discussing today. So to help break it all down are the authors of a recent in-depth white paper on the subject, aptly titled the same as this episode, The Impact of Technical Debt on Cybersecurity, are Claire McKenna, Senior Writer and Researcher at Bar Advisory, and Corey Neske, VP of Quantitative Risk here at Hive Systems. Claire and Corey, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Thanks.
So let's dive right into this. This white paper was a very comprehensive review of technical debt. Oftentimes, I think when we think about technical debt, it sounds more like an IT problem, updating old legacy systems, moving to new versions of Windows or Office or AD. But in this case, we were talking a little bit about cybersecurity. Claire, I think one of the key pieces to start with here is how did you guys look at and define technical debt in the white paper?
Yeah, so like you already mentioned in your introduction, Alex, the term technical debt has really just come to encompass so many different issues when we talk about it in the cybersecurity industry, from, silver bullet tooling, poor visibility, old assets, and weak governance. So understanding how technical debt can be a real challenge. In the white paper, we define technical debt as the result of taking shortcuts to meet short-term objectives at the expense of long-term flexibility and security.
Yeah, and in theory, technical debt isn't much different from financial debt. Thinking about a financial loan, you have money that you need today to buy a house or a car, but you end up paying a higher amount down the line. Technical debt works the same way. So similarly, incurring technical debt while building a product might improve your speed to market time now, but will cost your organization more in terms of time and money down the road.
Interesting. And I think that's really the intersection here about this is this idea that it's taking the short-term gains or what you perceive as short-term gains ultimately cost you in the long run. I think where that's interesting, though, is that sounds like very much an operational problem and an IT problem. So how and where does that intersect then with cybersecurity?
Well, the term technical debt we saw in our research as early as 1992, when developers explained the inevitable need to refactor their code or their system designs. Since then, we found hundreds of studies, dozens of tools specifically addressing code-related technical debt, and they've identified and explored the interdisciplinary nature of tech debt in software engineering, economics, finance, and each of these areas we know that it intersects with cybersecurity, but there's little research available that evaluates the impacts of technical debt on cybersecurity and compliance objectives specifically, which I was very surprised by, because I think anybody that was worked in cybersecurity and compliance just feels it, and they see it every day. They hear people complaining about the debt. As a security person, you're always saying, why can't we do this now? And it's a budget thing. And it's like, well, we'll do it later. We have to get to market, like you said earlier.
Yeah, and I would just add to that is, developers really focus on how their work impacts the availability of information assets, but cybersecurity professionals are really focused on how hackers, malware, or even malicious employees impact, the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. So then resource managers have to decide how much to fund cybersecurity efforts to really minimize that impact, doing so under the constraints of limited resources, and social pressures to keep productivity and innovation restrictions caused by cybersecurity controls to a minimum. And that cycle is going to inevitably result in reduced cybersecurity measures to more rapidly deliver information technology products and services, whether they're in support of employees within a company or a product sold to customers. So each time that company makes such a compromise, it's going to accrue some amount of technical debt. And eventually, they're either going to have to pay that off in the future, and it could become the cause of a data breach.
Claire, I like that idea that it's not just about companies that are in the software industry and developing tools, but it's just for companies at large that are leveraging other tools to do their business, manufacturing, healthcare, financial sector. They may not be developing things in-house, but that tech debt can impact both of those companies, whether they're developing in-house or not. Interesting. One of the things that I note in the white paper, you guys discuss the difference between both planned and unplanned technical debt. I think obviously here we're talking about both, again, these companies that are developing software in-house and companies that are just leveraging software and IT to support their business and, enable it here in the digital age. Where does that difference lie between those two, Claire?
Yeah, great question, Alex. So with planned debt, you know what you're getting into. You know that cutting corners now, it's going to make more work for your team in the future, but for whatever reason, you've explicitly decided that that's worth it. With unplanned technical debt, it might sound something like, oh, that must have slipped through the cracks. While innovation might thrive in the absence of bureaucracy and checklist compliance, so does error, right? We want engineers to design these new innovative airplanes, but we don't necessarily want the pilots of our flight to try new innovative flying techniques with us on board. So in this white paper, we really discuss the balance of innovation with operational excellence. And in information technology, operational excellence is going to be supported by policies, ticketing systems, checklists, change management, and audits that are going to keep people, processes, and technology standardized, where consistency is critical, preventing avoidable setbacks, which in turn reduces technical debt and gives us more time and resources for that innovation.
Some industries define technical debt only in the unplanned technical debt and that spontaneously emerges from inevitable circumstances. So what was designed at one point in time simply doesn't fit the objectives and circumstances of the business anymore. Businesses are then forced to scrap or ideally salvage what hardware, software, or processes they find themselves with, and rebuilding toward the new goals within the new constraints. Between the extremes of planned and unplanned technical debt is a state in which we may be aware that some type of debt is accumulating, but circumstances or denial prevent us from intervening. So the result is either more work pushed closer to your deadline or a concentration of tedious work that may impact your team's morale when it comes time to pay up and put in the work. And enough technical debt also makes you more fragile to operational continuity risks. So as you near a deadline, your team members call out sick, go on vacation, leave the company. So by holding too much technical debt, organizations cause the probability and or the impact of failure to increase as tasks are pushed closer and closer to the deadlines instead of closer to the present.
Corey, does that then mean that for planned debt, that's always a conscious decision for pushing things down the road or kicking the can down the road, and that unplanned debt is always unconscious? Or do you think there's kind of places where that could bridge in between the two?
I think it can. Like I said, I suggested there's a spectrum, and things can fall in between the two. There are a lot of things that are outside of our control that are going to cause technical debt. So as we've seen with COVID, a lot of people accumulated technical debt they never dreamed of, that they now have to deal with. But in other areas, it helped people take care of technical debt and gave them the time and the ability to back off from their projects and catch up on it. So I think in the industries we talked about, and from the research since 1992, it was a lot about we're going into technical debt head on. It's about software. We know the computers are going to be better in 10 years. And that's fine. But then other things will happen, like those incidentals, things less extreme than COVID, just causing the technical debt to accumulate. Even policy changes in compliance requirements are going to kind of, you'll suddenly find yourself having fallen behind when maybe you have Windows XP computers everywhere. And now not only is it everybody saying that's pretty bad, but you might be in a regulated entity that says that is banned. You cannot have a Windows XP computer anymore. And now you have to go through all your ATMs across the country and replace them, which is something that wasn't on the table up until you had a month's notice.
And that does actually bring me to my next point, which and a good segue there is what does technical debt look like? You described some scenarios where you're going and upgrading old computers, but what are some other symptoms and signs that it's starting to build up to a point that it needs to be addressed or potentially impacts a business?
That can happen in the planning stage, so failure to include a strategy to respond to issues as they arise. As the project goes on, poor documentation, issues with coding style may also be a signals of technical debt. And it might sound, the signal might be as simple as hearing, don't worry about the documentation for now. Just get the products out the door. We only have one person on the team who knows how to fix this code. Those are the red flags for your technical debt. And so rushing to release before testing is probably the most common sign of technical debt. It might sound like we don't have time to finish testing until after release, or we don't have time to set up a dev environment. We'll wait until later. So even if planned, if a company doesn't carefully track the decisions and prioritize remediating the consequences, it's easy for technical debt to become much more difficult to manage down the line. And we said this in other talks, feeling cornered into taking risks or feeling like there are no other options. Finding yourself in that position is a good indicator that technical debt caused a big problem for your organization. And those situations can be remedied by having a more transparent culture. If you're a manager who just gets openly upset at the messenger who's saying, like, we're falling behind, they're not going to tell you anymore. You're going to find yourself in a corner where you're not going to be able to, you're not going to have any options. So technical debt puts us in those positions where you have less flexibility to change course.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Corey. I'll just add to that a scenario that we discussed in our white paper of, when you might not even realize technical debt is incurring internally. So imagine, your department begins using this new internet-based tool. You access it via a web browser. It's phenomenal. It makes your work easier, it makes your work more efficient. The vendor support is really great. So your entire department starts using a free version of this tool, and it becomes a really big part of how you do business. So you love the tool, it's improving your work. Why don't you buy the paid version for even more functionality and use it across your entire organization? But after you purchase the paid version, your security and compliance team lets you know, hey, this tool isn't actually compliant with the type of data that we handle. It's really not going to work. However, there's this other tool. It's really similar in terms of functionality. It is compliant and secure, but it's going to take a huge number of person hours to transfer all of your data from that original tool to the new tool. So in this situation, you have some pretty difficult tech debt to overcome. You either have to take the risk of being non-compliant and not secure, which no one wants to do, inviting a potential data breach, or spend a lot more money and person hours than originally planned. So even, building internal reliance on web apps and outside tools prior to verifying their security and compliance posture is another common way that organizations can build debt that might otherwise be avoided.
I think that brings an interesting question there then, Claire. We're talking about tech debt as it relates to, a way that ultimately, I think we're thinking of tech debt as maybe you bought a car and over time that car has started to lose value. It's starting to need maintenance, repair, upgrades, updates. Is it potential then, therefore, that you could actually accrue tech debt almost instantaneously and making a poor choice in terms of your initial investment in a tool? If you started out and said, well, I know Windows 11 is out there, but the best we can roll out right now is Windows 10. Are you starting in at a foot behind? Do we consider that in that same realm as tech debt?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex. I would say so. I think that tech debt can really come from those choices, and it really ultimately just means that you need your leadership, you need the stakeholders and the decision makers in your organization to really be considering security and compliance top of mind to when they are making those decisions to have the idea that they need to prioritize security and compliance, and that goes for even, deciding which tools to use.
That example made me think, though, when you said upgrade to Windows 11, there's this other angle of tech debt that's going to come up, that you're upgrading too early, maybe rolling out Windows 11 before you know all the bugs, and then you need to go back and troubleshoot everything, and it's ended up being a kind of disaster. So like people, in some cases, hold off, kind of go into a little bit of potential technical debt until the bugs are worked out in the new operating system or software. Otherwise, they accumulate a technical debt with the best of intentions, which is another interesting flavor that we often encounter in security and IT.
Yeah, good point, Corey.
I think that probably leads then, there's definitely some ad hoc nature that I think leads to tech debt. So, as we know, the best way to conquer ad hoc problems is implementing some sort of process or framework. Claire, what does that kind of look like in terms of some steps that organizations can take then to prevent that technical debt from becoming an issue? Again, whether onboarding it immediately or it progressing over time.
Yeah, so I know Corey will probably have a few points to mention on this. The first ones that I will mention are just accountability and culture. So when it comes to accountability, I think a key mistake that a lot of small to medium-sized businesses make is really failing to assign accountability for security internally. So when you're at that size, it's just as important to have internal ownership of cybersecurity as it is to use tools and partners to simplify cybersecurity. So something we say at BAR a lot is, you can delegate everything except for accountability. And internal ownership can really prevent excess technical debt from building up. So even if your organization doesn't have the resources for a really dedicated security and compliance team, this might even just look like picking someone that's going to be the cybersecurity advocate. And their role is just to, within meetings, routinely ask, how is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data being protected? And that advocate can even be, included on a rotating basis, because when more people take on cybersecurity, there's an opportunity for diverse perspectives and more people understanding what it's like to be on both sides of the table when it comes to taking security seriously. And then finally, I'll just add that building a transparent culture that values and prioritizes security is important for every company. If you believe in your business and product, invest in building a cybersecurity culture, because a culture that values cybersecurity is one that's going to avoid the temptation to save money in the short term by cutting corners in development. And it's also one that's going to give everyone a seat at the table when it comes to communicating about cybersecurity risk. Give your employees a way to discuss technical debt. What are they seeing every day in their jobs? Then you can include them on your plan to remediate debt issues. And just, providing that space for everyone to be open and transparent is a really great step for every business.
I like that idea. I think that's kind of a key piece in this is the umami of that framework, right? Dealing with the cultural problems that come with this and, overstepping those and finding a way to conquer them. That accountability is obviously that second piece. Corey, talk to me a little bit more kind of from a actual rolling out a program around this. Obviously, we have the accountability and the cultural pieces to conquer, but what does this look like from a roadmap perspective?
Yeah, I will say that's a good foundation, accountability and culture. Those are things you implement and don't have to refactor. Like you're not getting into technical debt implementing those controls. Those are going to be timeless. They scale with whatever company size you have, so they're solid. I'll talk about some of the technical approaches, but they do need adjustment as technology advances, automation changes what it means to be information technology and stuff like that. But all of these, to some extent, they do scale from small to medium-sized businesses, and they can evolve, and they will evolve in how they're implemented. And the areas we found, or the themes, are effective planning, automation, best practices, and a security plan. For effective planning, it's the key step to preventing technical debt is to plan your project effectively and be aware of its creation. So tools that manage tasks and timelines like Asana or Jira or Trello can help with project planning. But it's important to remember that the tools can only be as effective when used properly. So keep everyone up to date and with the shared calendars, ensure everyone has access to the appropriate documents. And when you're planning your project, storyboard as much as possible. It's impossible to know every issue that might come up in the future, but if you map out your project in advance, you can refine your understanding of what risks you're taking. Your project plan should include the details on long-term operational costs necessary to support resources to reduce cybersecurity risk and how you'll keep up with annual maintenance. And so what it comes down to is kind of just future casting and playing out what your project is and what are the costs going to be afterward. Very common to see companies implement something that's amazing and everybody's excited about, but then when it comes to maintenance, it's like a tale as old as time at this point. It's like, oh, I didn't realize it's going to cost this much, or that we had to do these cybersecurity things too. And so one thing that can help with that, mitigate that effect, is automation. So if you implement an automated testing solution as continuous integration and other in all of your systems, that's a critical part of preventing your technical debt. Automation, I think, was probably largely driven by developers encountering technical debt and wishing they didn't have to spend as much time on it. So, and ensure each time that a change occurs, engineers are rigorously testing the product or the app for bugs or issues, and that saves time and prevents problems down the line. For best practices, it's important for your developers to use code writing best practices or a standard framework that people understand and that the community is building up, and everybody's checking each other's methods and making sure that they're doing things optimally and contributing their usually sometimes open source knowledge. So establishing a standardizing your code with proper documentation, like we said earlier. If somebody says documentation, don't worry about the documentation for now. This is where that comes in. It could increase development time, but it will pay off in the long run compared to a product written poorly. And if you just want a microcosm of this, think about doing something on Friday and then coming back Monday or after a vacation and trying to pick everything back up. You wish you had written something down so you could hit the ground running. Last thing was the security plan. Creating a sound cybersecurity plan from the beginning, in particular, so involving cybersecurity professionals in the early stages, or a cybersecurity advocate, like Claire was saying. They can help build that project roadmap, model the threats, help prioritize what needs to be done in the short term and what can wait. And there's lots of things that that don't make sense to do up front in terms of cybersecurity, but knowing where they are and making sure the project manager knows where they need to come in is critical. And that prevents your business from becoming overwhelmed with all the cybersecurity frameworks, and can speed up your development because it prevents late stage restructuring for cybersecurity measures, and sometimes just canceling a whole implementation because, in Claire's example, it's just too expensive to support what we were working toward. And one way that I'm biased in saying that you should do this is with quantitative risk assessment, specifically to understand the potential future risks. So the known good things and the unknown good things, but also the unknown bad things and how bad they can be, and quantifying those so that you can plan accordingly. And considering cybersecurity from day one can also reduce the friction in the sales cycle. So when a potential client sends a security questionnaire, if you're a vendor, or vendor questionnaires, you can provide the necessary assurances much faster than if you have to figure it out every time. If you have I think a lot of good paying clients or large clients are going to have mature programs where they're going to ask these questions. So the more that you have documented, the faster you can get that up, and you don't have to drop everything you're doing to accommodate that new client's sales request.
That is very interesting. And Claire, that actually takes me to my next question, which is perfectly timed. I think the idea of quantitative risk and finding kind of what is the cost or the risks associated with all of this is a key piece of the puzzle. From that side, though, for an organization that's got the culture, got the accountability, has this framework in place, how do you end up managing it? Is it just a matter of throwing money at the problem and saying, "Hey, we're just going to fix all the things that have piled up. We're going to upgrade our licenses. We're going to go back and document. We're going to hire a bunch of people," or is there a better way to ultimately approach it?
Yeah, great question, Alex. So yeah, even for organizations that do everything right in the early stages, some technical debt might be inevitable. And just like financial debt, not all technical debt needs to be this entirely negative thing, as long as it's paid back in a timely and appropriate manner. So kind of like Corey mentioned earlier, having that project planning can really help. In our research, we found that some developers and engineers actually argue that technical debt is a good thing because it points to short-term wins that can be paid off eventually. But from a cybersecurity perspective, we just say in our white paper, before you take out that technical loan, just ask yourself, how confident are you that you'll remember to patch that vulnerability or upgrade that system next quarter at the latest? How confident are you that you'll have the resources to do so? So as long as technical debt is monitored and addressed on a scheduled and regular basis, I think a reasonable amount of technical debt is understandable for many businesses.
Yeah, I think startups and small businesses can pay down that debt by establishing, like you said, a sustainable means of tracking it and reporting to leadership or the people who decide how human and financial resources are spent on technology. Even if that's you, putting it out on paper can really help. Tech debt is inconspicuous until it starts causing problems a lot of the time. With financial, our finance and accounting culture is very explicit, and so it's how much money's in your bank account. It's a big deal when the bank's off. You don't let them even be a few cents off. But at technical debt, we don't have that kind of accounting or accountability. So it's important to take special care to recognize it and keep track whether it's increasing or decreasing. Without deliberately keeping technical debt in the forefront of our resource planning activities, it'll continue to accrue unnoticed and quickly be forgotten in the face of more exciting business demands. And that's in terms of the business wanting managers trying to be successful, but also employees wanting to do interesting work, which is probably not technical debt makeup a lot of the time, but it can be. So some organizations will encounter tech debt only occasionally, but will carry a balance that they want to keep relatively low. In either case, it's usually more practical to pay it off over time than put the business on hold until you've caught up. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, maybe that brings up an interesting question then. When we're talking about kind of balancing tech debt and then maybe that some tech debt is good, I feel like that aligns a little bit closer to cybersecurity and risk management at the end of the day. Claire, I guess that's kind of the question is when we think about risks from a cybersecurity perspective, we often balance the risk versus the reward, or what is the actual chance that that risk may come to fruition and cause us problems. Could you potentially manage tech debt that same way where you say, yeah, we know we're behind on our Windows upgrades, but it's not causing any huge issues, but at least maybe we have a plan in place to fix that within the near future. Could that be an acceptable outcome for certain businesses?
I would say that it's an acceptable outcome if you have, your payoff plan, if you have that inventory of all of your software, kind of any issues or potential issues, and you have a strategy, similarly to how you want to have threat modeling in place to figure out what to prioritize. I would say that you would want to address any tech debt also through a risk management strategy. So prioritize by eliminating the highest risks first and then move your way down. And just schedule regular time and resources that are going to address those issues.
Yeah, and I would add again or plug quantitative risk in that case, because if you're quantifying, you're able to compare up against what is debt in a more tangible way. So paying down tech debt is going to involve spending money directly or indirectly. It's going to be new hardware, software, contracts, work, or wages. And the reality is you have to spend resources to pay off neglected technology and neglected processes that support them, or deliberately or otherwise. And so I think if you are doing a risk-based approach that facilitates making your payoff plan and making one that's reasonable, not something that's just to put on paper for to ease people's anxiety, but something that is actually feasible. And yeah, that's going to involve having that inventory of what you're dealing with, of the software, the hardware in your network, making note of the issues and vulnerabilities, and then addressing those, like you said, in that order. I wouldn't say necessarily by order of risk, but by order of risk, and then factoring in what's the cost of the control. And that can be difficult if you're not putting everything on paper into numbers. There might be amazing control that's going to reduce all kinds of technical debt or security problems, but it's going to take 6 months to implement by the nature of the tool, like maybe a network or data center refactoring or change in how you're doing things. So you have to weigh, can we do 17 of these payoff strategies now, and then the 6-month thing? And the only way you can really do that is by quantifying and looking at the different costs and benefits.
That is interesting. One of the things that you mentioned earlier too, Corey, was the idea of how to kind of conquer this. And I think one of those methods ultimately is our end-all be-all recommendation for everything these days, is looking at automation. Obviously, not all tech debt can be prevented through automation, but it probably is a huge opportunity for a lot of companies. Where does that kind of look, or how could that potentially be managed to help offset or more importantly, prevent tech debt from accruing to levels that cause problems?
Smaller organizations can automate tech debt management by setting themselves calendar reminders, as simple as that, using vulnerability management solutions that report on outstanding vulnerabilities after each scan, what's still there since the previous scan, what's new out there, how severe are they, or establishing just routine business processes like recurring compliance and risk assessment reviews that bring the promises made back to management's attention. So it sounds kind of boring, traditional cybersecurity and that sort of thing, but just having a calendar with files underneath it, if you want to do full paper, or ideally using your that says, on these events, you have this ritual of we do this assessment, we think about those debts that we took out. You have to create the tracking mechanism artificially, because we don't have the infrastructure that finance has when it comes to keeping track of debt. So our calendars and our project management tools are a key part of the automation and vulnerability scanners.
Yeah, I just add to that there are so many automation solutions available that really do facilitate keeping track of promises. Like Corey mentioned, some of those solutions are just calendar-based reminders, letting people know that they have some due diligence when it comes to compliance or risk activities. But there are also these compliance monitoring solutions that can automate the activities themselves wherever possible, saving organizations a lot of time from having to manually collect and upload evidence. And this kind of automation reduces the cost and user error that comes with manual equivalence, and does so in parallel at scale, which was not previously possible.
That is a good point. Ultimately, yeah, I think that may be the key idea here, is that automation doesn't necessarily mean always an expensive tool or the most expensive tool to make it happen. It could just be a process that's repeatable at the end of the day, and is able to be used by a company in a meaningful way. I think that really, from my side, that's probably one of the most interesting things in all of this and through a lot of tech debt is it is really an alignment with a maturity model to a certain extent to make sure that there's repeatable processes to prevent this. But that key piece at the end of the day is acknowledging that tech debt is an issue. It's a looming issue. It's not just about delivering the software or managing the day-to-day business processes, but finding a way to stay on top of that. And I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. Claire, from your side, any final thoughts to share about technical debt before we call it an episode today?
Yeah, so final thoughts from me is really just that technical debt for all organizations is going to be a balancing act. It would be naive to assume that an organization is going to be able to avoid technical debt entirely. So instead, preventing the accumulation of technical debt early on and strategically managing it over time before it becomes a real issue, and in order to prioritize cybersecurity is going to be the ticket for success.
Corey, what about you?
I think a major theme across the research that stands out is innovation. And you can see this theme in history books about in any industry, but we're seeing it in cybersecurity more. And it's that innovation is no longer just about delivering solutions. There are side effects and like sludge and toxic waste that gets created that we have to take care of in cybersecurity or in IT, I guess. And cybersecurity is kind of like the cleanup crew a lot of the time. So cybersecurity has become critical for organizations at every stage, not just even cleanup. They have to be part of the planning process to make the cleanup feasible. As we saw in the earlier days of the research on technical debt in software development, more research will come to light on the intersections of cybersecurity and technical debt, I hope. And so organizations should stay informed on those trends, best practices, this new component of cybersecurity and compliance. And I think that's being seen more and more in headlines, getting the cybersecurity in the boardroom. And we're headed in that direction, but we don't have that pile of research and tooling that we saw in the literature yet. But I'm looking forward to it.
I think that is great, and I think that's going to be the continued idea here with tech debt is that it continues to be something that I think starts to bubble up more, especially with the pace of technology these days. It's easy to fall behind quickly, and more importantly, for that to have a huge impact on companies. One of the big areas, of course, we saw where tech debt reared its head was for companies that had really prioritized remote work during the COVID pandemic, and so for those that had never thought about it or thought to address it, there was a lot of quick scramble. So obviously we've seen that recently, and I think we will continue to see that into the future. That is all the time we have today. I want to thank Corey and Claire for joining us and helping make technical debt and its impacts on cybersecurity more approachable. One of the key takeaways that I had is that tech debt is something that can creep up over time, but it's also something that can happen instantaneously with bad decisions and poor planning. Taking a look at things like accountability and culture are a huge piece of the puzzle. And so for any business, I think it's something that you should start to examine and include in your system development lifecycle as you start to evaluate IT products, making sure that you're making the right decisions. We hope you'll share this episode with your colleagues who may be struggling with technical debt, whether on your team or otherwise. Of course, both Corey and Claire are the authors of a recent white paper on the topic, The Impact of Technical Debt on Cybersecurity. And you can download a copy of that white paper for free, no information required, from our website at www.hivesystems.io. We'll also drop a direct link to that download in our show notes, so you'll be able to grab that and download a copy today. That's all the time we have. We want to thank you for joining us. And as always, our experts here at Hive Systems help make your cybersecurity journey more approachable. So please reach out to us anytime by contacting us at www.hivesystems.io. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted about our next episode by going online again to www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Next month, we're going to be talking about another exciting topic from the world of cybersecurity, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react. Thank you very much.